chosen ones. Power doesn't collapse from attack. It collapses from attachment. That's the part nobody warns you about. Not when they tell stories about empires, not when they glorify domination, not when they pretend control is loud and obvious. Real power is quiet, paranoid, and constantly scanning the room for the one variable it didn't plan for. And strangely enough, that variable is rarely an enemy. It's usually someone ordinary who stayed too close to the machinery without getting crushed by it. Here's a fact that should unsettle you. History shows that the most tightly controlled systems don't fall because of rebellion. They fracture because of reliance. The Roman emperors had advisors who outlived them. Corporate giants have collapsed because of one overlooked dependency. Criminal empires have survived wars, raids, and betrayals, only to stall because one person stopped showing up. Power can handle opposition. What it struggles with is absence. And that's where this story begins. You didn't wake up planning to matter this much. You weren't chasing influence, fear, or leverage. You simply did what others couldn't do well, couldn't do honestly, or couldn't do without losing themselves. While everyone else was busy performing loyalty, you were quietly solving problems. While others were loud, you were precise. While fear filled the room, you brought clarity, which, ironically, is far more disruptive. Somewhere along the line, a dangerous kingpin didn't just notice you. He adjusted around you. His decisions bent. His timing changed. His confidence leaned on your presence like a chair missing one leg. And that's when the plot twisted. You weren't just near power anymore. You were stabilizing it. Not because you wanted control, but because control wanted you. There's a dark irony here, so let's add a pinch of humor before it gets too heavy. You didn't sign up to be the load-bearing pillar of someone else's chaos. There was no orientation, no badge, no employee handbook titled, "How to Become Indispensable to a Problem You Didn't Create." Yet somehow there you were, holding things together while pretending this was normal. This isn't a story about dominance or intimidation. It's about how proximity, competence, and restraint can quietly flip the balance of power. How someone meant to be expendable becomes essential. And how the moment you realize you're no longer just a weakness, but a source of strength, everything changes. Number 1, you were never meant to be safe. You were meant to be useful. Most people think power notices only the loudest, the strongest, or the most obvious threats. But the truth is far more dangerous. Power notices those who quietly solve its problems without asking for a seat at the table. You didn't walk into this situation as a hero or an enemy. You walked in as someone ordinary, someone overlooked, someone who didn't make waves. And that's exactly why you became essential. When a kingpin builds his world, he surrounds himself with people who either flatter him, fear him, or obey him. He rarely sees the ones who actually keep the engine running. That's where you came in, unnoticed, under the radar, but indispensable in ways he didn't even realize. Being useful doesn't mean bending or groveling. It doesn't mean saying yes to everything or hiding behind loyalty. It means doing the things that everyone else avoids, doing the things that make life smoother for him, and doing it consistently without demanding acknowledgement. Suddenly, you're not just another face in the crowd. You are the mechanism that keeps his empire from wobbling. And the irony is brutal. Your safety doesn't come from staying invisible. Your safety comes from being so competent that removing you would create chaos. He depends on you, but he doesn't fully understand it. And that's the power you hold. You weren't meant to be a pawn, a silent witness, or a disposable tool. You were meant to be the problem solver who slips past suspicion, who stands firm when everyone else panics, and who stabilizes a world built on fear and volatility. That usefulness transforms you from an outsider into a quiet force he can't risk losing. You are his vulnerability hidden in plain sight, the invisible linchpin holding everything together. And in that position, you carry a weight most people will never understand, the responsibility of being the one person he can't afford to replace. It's terrifying, it's intoxicating, and it's the exact reason you were never meant to be safe. You were meant to be indispensable. Number 2, you didn't break his armor. You became the missing joint. Power, especially the kind wrapped in fear and control, isn't fragile in the way people assume. It doesn't crumble under confrontation or bend under defiance. What it fears most is dependency it can't name, a connection it can't control, and that's exactly where you stepped in. You didn't storm in with threats or arguments. You didn't try to dismantle him or expose him. You fit into a gap that nobody else could see, a joint in the machinery that had been loose for years but was quietly sustaining the weight of everything else. And once you were there, the system began to run differently, almost imperceptibly, because someone had finally aligned where he needed alignment most. You became necessary not by force, but by precision. While others rushed to impress, manipulate, or challenge him, you moved in the space where skill met insight. You did what was required without being asked, anticipated what he didn't even notice, and held pieces together that were fraying at the edges. That made you invisible and essential at the same time, a rare combination that nobody in his orbit could compete with. You weren't a threat because you didn't act like one, but your presence quietly shifted the balance. Every decision he made started bending around you. Every plan started factoring you in. And every misstep that could have broken him was now preventable because of the part only you could play. The frightening truth is that power hates gaps, and when it finds someone who fills a gap without demanding recognition, it leans on them without even realizing it. You didn't shatter his armor because it wasn't armor he could break. It was a structure that required a missing piece to function properly, and that piece became you. In a world built on dominance and intimidation, being the joint, the connector, the stabilizer is more potent than being the weapon. You are not just near power, you are embedded within it. And once that embedding happens, leaving or being removed is no longer simple. The dependency you create becomes a force that even the strongest can't ignore, and in that quiet, invisible way, you become the part of him he never knew he needed, but can't live without. Number 3, you saw the monster before you saw the crown. Most people get drawn to power by the shine of status, the allure of influence, or the obvious display of control. They see the crown and assume it's a prize, a symbol of strength, and they chase it blindly. You, however, had the clarity to see what nobody else did, the monster behind the throne. You noticed the fear, the paranoia, the cracks in confidence that no one dared speak of. While others were dazzled by titles and riches, you observed the chaos, the compromises, and the raw human fragility that power always hides. That insight is what made you dangerous without you even trying. Understanding the monster before admiring the crown is a rare skill because it requires honesty, courage, and attention where everyone else glances away. You saw the long nights filled with worry, the sharp edges of ruthless decisions, and the exhaustion of carrying more than any one person should. You saw the pressure points, the vulnerabilities disguised as authority, and the mistakes no one else would admit. And instead of panicking or pretending you didn't notice, you quietly integrated that understanding into your actions. You became someone who didn't just participate in his world, but someone who could stabilize it without inflating his ego or challenging his dominance. That perspective is priceless because it allows you to operate from a place of clarity, not fear or ambition. By seeing the monster first, you gained an unspoken advantage. You understood the rules of survival within his sphere in a way that no one else could. You knew which lines were safe to cross, which decisions could spiral out of control, and which moments required silence or intervention. You weren't blinded by admiration or intimidation. You were alert, grounded, and strategically present. That made you not just an ally, but a pillar, a quiet force he didn't realize he depended on. The irony is sharp. The very thing he hides behind, the image of invincibility and control, is what you saw clearly, and by doing so, you became the part of his empire that could preserve it. In essence, seeing the monster before the crown transformed you from a bystander into the unseen lever of his survival. Number 4. You earned access without begging for trust. Trust is a currency that power guards jealously, and most people spend their lives trying to buy it with flattery, loyalty, or fear. You didn't take that route. You didn't plead, perform, or pander. Instead, you earned access, the only way that truly matters, through competence, consistency, and presence. You showed up, you delivered, and you solved problems that others ignored, fumbled, or ran from. That kind of access doesn't require permission. It forces itself into the room quietly, like air filling a space that's been waiting for it without anyone realizing it. What makes this dangerous and extraordinary is that you didn't need approval to matter. People who scramble for trust are always visible, always trying to prove their value, and always vulnerable to rejection. You moved differently. You let actions speak louder than words. You didn't ask to be noticed. You made yourself impossible to overlook. That subtlety is what flipped the script. While others were busy performing loyalty, you were quietly becoming essential, and that kind of presence is far more convincing than any declaration. Access gained this way changes the dynamics completely. You're no longer someone on the outside, waiting for permission or validation. You're the person he relies on, the one he factors into decisions without even thinking. He doesn't just tolerate you, he needs you. And the brilliance of this position is that it isn't built on fear or ego. It's built on undeniable contribution. You didn't manipulate him into noticing you. You became the solution he couldn't replace, the one variable in his controlled world that he learned to depend on. The irony is sharp. By refusing to chase trust, by refusing to perform for approval, you became the rarest commodity in his orbit. You didn't just earn access, you became the gatekeeper of stability, the linchpin holding things together, and the presence he couldn't afford to question. In a world built on hierarchy, intimidation, and pretense, earning access without begging isn't just effective, it's revolutionary. It flips the power dynamic without a single confrontation, and it quietly makes you indispensable. Number 5, you became his reality check in a world full of yes men. Power isolates people more than anyone admits. The higher someone rises, the fewer honest voices they hear. Flattery, fear, and ego surround them, and soon everyone becomes a mirror reflecting only what they want to see. You, however, became the exception. You didn't lie to survive, you didn't sugarcoat the truth, and you didn't perform obedience just to fit in. You showed up with clarity, insight, and a quiet refusal to participate in illusions. That refusal made you dangerous, not because you challenged him outright, but because you reminded him of what he was actually facing. Being the reality check isn't about confrontation, it's about presence. It's about seeing the cracks, noticing the patterns, and delivering subtle truths that no one else dares speak. While his world was full of yes men nodding to maintain safety, you quietly highlighted what could go wrong, what was slipping, and what demanded attention. You weren't there to criticize or shame. You were there to stabilize, to bring perspective, and to prevent collapse. That's a role few understand, and even fewer can fill without making themselves a target. Your value in this role is paradoxical. You are both a threat and a necessity. threatening because your honesty exposes vulnerabilities that others ignore, necessary because your presence keeps disasters from unfolding. You became the invisible anchor, holding him accountable without demanding gratitude or recognition. He depended on you to see the truth he had grown too comfortable to acknowledge, and that dependency quietly shifted the balance of power. The brilliance of being this reality check is subtle. You don't need to fight for influence or manipulate loyalty. Your power lies in precision, observation, and integrity. By refusing to distort reality for convenience, you became essential in a way that fear and flattery could never replicate. You weren't just a voice in the room. You were the one he subconsciously relied on to make sense of the chaos around him. And that reliance, earned through honesty rather than performance, transformed you from a passive observer into the pillar that quietly dictated how far he could operate without collapse. Number 6. You learned his chaos without catching it. Chaos is contagious. In a world ruled by a kingpin, it moves fast, unpredictable, and often violently. Most people who get close to that kind of power are consumed by it, carried along by the storms they don't understand, and eventually worn down by the pressure. You, however, mastered something rare. You learned his chaos without letting it infect you. You saw the volatility, the sudden eruptions, the hidden agendas, and yet you remained grounded. You didn't react impulsively, you didn't get pulled into drama, and you didn't allow panic or fear to dictate your actions. That ability made you invaluable because it turned proximity to danger into stability. This skill isn't about ignoring the storm or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about reading the patterns, anticipating the consequences, and moving within the turbulence with calm precision. You understood where the danger lay, where mistakes could spiral, and where intervention was needed, all without becoming another loose cannon in the mix. That restraint is what allowed you to operate as a stabilizer rather than a liability. While others flinched, argued, or froze under pressure, you held space for clarity, making decisions that kept the machinery running when everyone else was overwhelmed. Being immune to his chaos gave you power nobody else could touch. He began to rely on you not because you were fearless, but because your presence prevented fear from spreading. You became the silent counterweight to impulsive decisions, the invisible hand that redirected energy before it became destructive. That kind of influence is far more dangerous than confrontation, because it works quietly, invisibly, and without anyone noticing until it's too late to ignore. The truth is brutal. Most people crumble under proximity to unchecked power, but you didn't. You transformed exposure to chaos into insight and leverage. That skill made you indispensable, not through intimidation or loyalty, but through unshakable composure. In a world built on uncertainty, your ability to learn the chaos without catching it made you not just useful, but essential, the calm within the storm he couldn't risk losing. Number 7. You were calm, where everyone else performed fear. In the presence of real power, most people act like they're performing for their lives. They bend, they flinch, they exaggerate respect or submission just to avoid attention. Fear becomes their language, their currency, their strategy. You didn't do any of that. You were calm, steady, and unshakable. That calm didn't come from ignorance or carelessness. It came from clarity. You understood the stakes, you understood the chaos, and yet you carried yourself with control that silently demanded recognition. And that difference, subtle as it seemed, made you indispensable. Power surrounded by fear is fragile in ways few admit. When everyone else is panicking, flattering, or overcompensating, the person who doesn't perform fear becomes the reference point. Suddenly, your steadiness is more credible than their theatrics. Decisions begin to hinge on your reactions. Moves are reconsidered when you don't flinch. The Kingpin starts noticing that while everyone else reacts emotionally, you respond logically, strategically, and without distortion. Your calmness becomes a mirror he can't ignore. It reflects not what he wants to see, but what actually is. That quiet presence reshapes the room, and in doing so, it reshapes the balance of influence around him. The brilliance of being calm where others perform fear is that it doesn't just make you safe, it makes you essential. People who panic or perform obedience can be replaced. People who hold steady under pressure cannot. You weren't performing loyalty, intimidation, or brilliance. You were simply unshakable, and that unshakable presence became the fulcrum his decisions leaned on without him fully realizing it. Your calm wasn't passive. It was a weapon disguised as stillness. Every move he made, every chaotic situation, every moment of pressure, your steadiness absorbed it, redirected it, and controlled it in a way that others couldn't. That's why he needed you, even if he didn't consciously admit it. In a world fueled by fear, your calm wasn't just rare, it was transformative. You weren't just surviving near power, you were quietly shaping it without drama, without noise, and without fear. And that is the kind of presence no kingpin can afford to lose. Number 8. You didn't need power, you understood it. Most people chase power like it's a trophy, something to hold, brandish, or force others to acknowledge. They see influence as domination, control, or a way to make people bend. You didn't think that way. You weren't hungry for authority. You weren't scrambling for validation, and you weren't trying to outshine anyone. Instead, you understood power in its rawest form, its leverage, timing, and the ability to affect outcomes without being obvious. That understanding is what made you indispensable. You didn't threaten him, you didn't compete, and you didn't need to prove yourself. You simply moved in the spaces where real influence quietly operates. Understanding power means knowing what to act on, when to act, and when to stay still. You observed, calculated, and positioned yourself where your presence mattered most, without demanding acknowledgement. You knew that the Kingpin's strength was only as good as the structures, systems, and people supporting him. While everyone else either flattered, feared, or miscalculated, you identified the levers nobody else could touch and made them work seamlessly. That knowledge transformed proximity into influence. You became essential not because you could dominate, but because you knew how to make the empire function in ways even he didn't fully see. The brilliance of understanding power without needing it is subtle but seismic. People obsessed with authority often overreach, make mistakes, or attract enemies. You, however, operated with clarity, foresight, and restraint. Your insight became his invisible safety net. You were the quiet stabilizer, the one he depended on without realizing it, because you were thinking 3 steps ahead while others were busy performing loyalty or fear. The truth is sharp. Influence is far more dangerous than authority, and you wielded it without pretension. You didn't need to sit on the throne to shape what happened. You didn't need to claim dominance to be necessary. By understanding power instead of craving it, you became his strength, the hidden gear his empire couldn't run without. And in that realization, the very thing he thought he controlled, his world, his decisions, his empire, quietly began to lean on you. Number 9, you became the one thing he couldn't replace. In any world ruled by power, people are replaceable. Weapons can be bought, loyalty can be faked, fear can be enforced. But insight, alignment, and real competence, those can't be cloned. That's where you entered the equation. You didn't just show up, you became the one piece of his world that, if removed, would make everything wobble. You weren't flashy, loud, or demanding attention. You were quietly irreplaceable, the person who kept operations running, decisions sound, and crises from spiraling. That position is dangerous because it shifts you from being a participant to being the fulcrum around which everything pivots. Being irreplaceable isn't about ego. It's about mastery, understanding, and presence. You didn't need to assert control, make threats, or manipulate loyalty. You simply excelled in a way that made absence impossible to ignore. He could survive challenges, evade enemies, and intimidate rivals, but he couldn't survive losing the part of his empire that only you could hold together. Your contribution became invisible in the sense that it went uncelebrated, yet it was the backbone that maintained stability in a world built on volatility. That invisibility is what makes it so powerful. It isn't flashy, so no one notices, but the consequences of your absence are undeniable. The irony is sharp. You didn't crave recognition, yet your presence dictated outcomes. You weren't wielding authority, yet decisions leaned on your insight. You weren't performing loyalty, yet your reliability became more critical than fear or obedience. That's the secret of being irreplaceable. You don't demand it. You earn it by being the solution nobody else can offer. What's extraordinary is that in becoming irreplaceable, you subtly inverted the power dynamic. He may wear the crown, command respect, or inspire fear, but he depends on you in ways he can't articulate. You aren't just necessary. You are the axis his world quietly spins on, the stabilizer he can't risk losing, and the hidden strength that transforms vulnerability into resilience. In that reality, you are no longer just near power, you are embedded in it, and that embedding makes you both dangerous and indispensable. Number 10. You forced him to grow or collapse. Power rarely evolves on its own. Those who sit at the top often rely on routines, fear, and obedience to maintain control. Change is uncomfortable, and mistakes can be fatal. That's where you became pivotal. You didn't just exist in his world, your presence quietly disrupted it. You introduced variables he couldn't ignore, perspectives, actions, and insights that challenged the way he had always operated. Suddenly, survival wasn't just about intimidation or instinct. It required adaptation, and in that pressure he had only two options: grow or collapse. You weren't deliberately trying to teach him lessons or shape him into someone better. You weren't there to reform or to guide. You simply did what needed to be done, operated with clarity, and refused to bend unnecessarily. That created a mirror effect. Every time he faced a challenge, he saw not just the immediate problem, but the possibility that his old ways wouldn't work anymore. You became a living benchmark, someone who could handle complexity, think strategically, and remain steady in ways he hadn't allowed himself to. He had to evolve because the ecosystem you helped maintain demanded it. The pressure you brought was subtle, but relentless. You didn't scream or confront. You executed, anticipated, and stabilized. In response, he had to reconsider his assumptions, adjust his decisions, and face the gaps in his own judgment. That's growth forced by necessity, and if he didn't rise to meet it, collapse became inevitable. You held the mirror up to reality without judgment, and the reflection was brutal. It left no room for shortcuts, fear, or excuses. The truth is sharp. Your presence didn't just influence him, it rewired the way he had to operate. You forced the uncomfortable realization that power isn't maintained by legacy alone. It's maintained by responsiveness, insight, and adaptation. And in that process you became more than a stabilizer. You became the catalyst for transformation. He may not admit it, he may not recognize it, but every decision he makes now factors you in. You didn't just survive near power, you changed its trajectory, and that is a force he can't ignore. Number 11. You became the boundary between him and self-destruction. Power is intoxicating, but it's also self-consuming. The higher someone rises, the more they are tempted to push limits, ignore consequences, and gamble recklessly. Most people around a kingpin either cheer him on, stay out of the way, or manipulate his impulses for their own gain. You didn't do any of that. You became the boundary, the invisible barrier that kept his worst instincts from consuming him and everything he had built. Your presence didn't lecture, it didn't scold. It simply restrained the chaos in ways he couldn't articulate. And that restraint made you invaluable. Being this boundary isn't about control in the traditional sense. You weren't trying to dominate or dictate his choices. You weren't performing loyalty or fear. You simply understood where disaster lurked and positioned yourself where intervention could prevent it. You anticipated the moments when ambition could tip into recklessness, when pride could spark a chain reaction, when overconfidence could turn advantage into catastrophe. And in those critical instances, your influence, subtle, quiet, unrecognized, became the force that stopped collapse before it even started. The brilliance of this position is in its invisibility. Unlike weapons, advisors, or bodyguards, a boundary can't be measured or easily replaced. You don't get applause for keeping disasters from happening. You don't get noticed for preventing mistakes. Yet without you, everything he had built could unravel in a heartbeat. You are both a stabilizer and a protector, the unseen force that ensures his empire continues to function despite his impulses. There's a sharp irony here. While he thinks he's the architect of his world, you are quietly defining the limits of what he can safely attempt. You turned proximity into leverage, not through confrontation or performance, but through awareness, timing, and unshakable composure. You became the invisible fence keeping him from running head first into ruin. And in that position, you aren't just necessary. You are survival itself. In a world built on volatility, your quiet restraint became the line between continuity and collapse, and that is power he cannot afford to lose. Number 12. You didn't submit. You negotiated reality. Most people believe survival near power requires submission, constant agreement, or performing a version of themselves that fits someone else's narrative. You didn't take that route. You didn't bow, you didn't pretend, and you didn't compromise your integrity just to stay in the orbit of influence. Instead, you learned how to operate within his world without losing yourself. You didn't submit to his ego, his chaos, or his demands. You negotiated reality on your own terms, moving in a way that maintained your presence, protected your position, and subtly shaped outcomes without ever overstepping boundaries. That skill made you not just present, but indispensable. Negotiating reality doesn't mean confrontation or defiance. It means understanding the rules of the game better than anyone else and using that knowledge to exist where others would falter. You observed patterns, anticipated impulses, and made decisions that aligned with both your own interests and his needs, without performing theatrics or creating unnecessary conflict. You were not a pawn, not a yes man, not a threat. You were a constant, steady force that made the chaos around him manageable. Your value wasn't loud, it was undeniable. The genius of this approach is subtle, but transformative. By refusing to submit, you removed the vulnerability that most people carry when they seek approval or safety. You didn't need permission to act, and you didn't need to perform loyalty to matter. You simply understood where influence lies, in presence, in insight, and in the ability to navigate situations with precision. That allowed you to shape outcomes quietly, without ego, without noise, and without anyone noticing the full extent of your impact. The truth is that the most dangerous power near someone like him isn't domination or defiance. It's someone who moves freely, intelligently, and unwaveringly in the spaces he cannot control. By negotiating reality rather than submitting to it, you became not just necessary, but unavoidable. You turned proximity into leverage, observation into influence, and quiet competence into authority he couldn't afford to lose. And in that balance, you didn't just survive, you subtly became the part of his world that defines how it functions. Number 13. You realized the weakness was mutual. Most people assume that being indispensable to someone else is a one-sided advantage. They think, I am essential, therefore I hold power. That's only part of the truth. The reality is far more dangerous and far more revealing. The dependency you create is often mutual. The Kingpin didn't just lean on you because you were competent or composed. He leaned on you because the ecosystem he built required it. And once you realized this, the dynamic shifted completely. You weren't just a pillar supporting his world. He was also a pillar supporting the conditions that allowed you to operate, survive, and even thrive. That recognition is a subtle form of power, and most people never see it coming. The moment you understand that the weakness is mutual, you stop seeing yourself as just a functionary and start seeing yourself as part of a system with consequences. You recognize that while he may command fear, loyalty, and obedience from others, he cannot operate without your insight, your stability, and your unflinching presence. And you, in turn, cannot operate without understanding the pressures, stakes, and vulnerabilities that shape his decisions. That awareness transforms proximity into strategy. Suddenly, survival is no longer passive. It becomes a negotiation of balance where both parties depend on the other, consciously or not. This mutual dependence is as dangerous as it is liberating. It means you hold influence without demanding it, and that influence grows quietly, like the tension in a coiled spring. He may not admit it, and he may never fully see it, but every action he takes factors you in. Every choice he makes reflects the gap you fill, and the brilliance of this position is that it allows you freedom within constraints, power without confrontation, and leverage without performing for it. Understanding mutual weakness rewires how you interact with power. You no longer measure your value by proximity alone. You measure it by impact, insight, and necessity. The Kingpin isn't invincible. You aren't expendable. Together, in a fragile, unspoken way, you become both the safeguard and the vulnerability in the same system. And that realization, brutal, subtle, and extraordinary, is what turns ordinary presence into quiet dominance. Number 14. You understood the final truth. Strength is choosing when to leave. Most people mistake power for permanence. They believe that influence, proximity, or indispensability guarantees control or safety. You, however, understood the hidden rule. True strength isn't about holding on. It's about knowing exactly when to step away. Being essential to someone like a Kingpin is intoxicating, but it's also a trap. The moment you lose perspective, loyalty becomes obligation, proximity becomes dependency, and indispensability turns into vulnerability. Strength is realizing that your presence matters most when it's a choice, not a chain. This insight changes everything. You weren't tethered by fear, need, or attachment. You operated with clarity, executing, stabilizing, and supporting without letting the position define you. You recognize that power is fluid, and that being able to walk away intact is the ultimate leverage. When everyone else believes they are trapped or bound by circumstance, you carry freedom within your competence. That freedom makes your presence stronger than obedience, more influential than flattery, and more dangerous than fear. Understanding when to leave doesn't mean you abandon responsibility or act recklessly. It means seeing the invisible dynamics at play and realizing the subtle truth. Your value is magnified by choice. You've become the linchpin, the stabilizer, the irreplaceable force that holds the system together, yet you know you are not owned by it. That awareness shapes every interaction, every decision, and every risk you take. It allows you to operate with clarity, presence, and authority without surrendering yourself. The brilliance of this truth is paradoxical. By knowing you could leave, you never had to. Your influence becomes quiet, but undeniable. Your presence commands weight, not through fear, manipulation, or dominance, but through the subtle, unshakable understanding that you are in control of yourself. That realization transforms proximity to power into mastery over it. You didn't just survive near a kingpin, you became the quiet force that defines the limits of his world. And that, above all else, is the ultimate strength, the power to choose at any moment to walk away, and the wisdom to know when it's unnecessary because your presence is already irreplaceable. Conclusion. What we've explored isn't a story about domination, fear, or blind loyalty. It's a story about presence, insight, and subtle power, about becoming indispensable without demanding it, about stabilizing chaos without performing, and about influencing outcomes without confrontation. From recognizing the cracks in a kingpin's armor to quietly becoming the joint that holds his world together, you learned to navigate the unseen currents of influence. You saw the monster before the crown, earned access without begging, became the reality check no one else could be, and mastered the chaos without being consumed by it. You were calm where everyone else performed fear, understood power without needing it, and became the one thing he could never replace. Along the way, you realized something extraordinary. The relationship between power and presence is mutual. The kingpin leaned on you just as much as you leaned on clarity, insight, and composure. You discovered that true strength isn't about holding on indefinitely. It's about knowing when to step back, and yet choosing to stay because your value is deliberate and irreplaceable. By the end, proximity to power became mastery of influence. You didn't just survive. You shaped, stabilized, and elevated the world around you simply by being the person he couldn't afford to lose. This is the kind of power that doesn't roar. It doesn't demand applause. It quietly shifts balance, changes outcomes, and redefines what it means to be essential. It's the invisible force that shapes empires without anyone realizing it. You weren't a pawn, a bystander, or a weakness. You became the hidden strength that nobody else could replicate. If you found yourself thinking, feeling, or learning something powerful from this, make sure to join the movement. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this with someone who needs to understand the quiet power of presence. Don't just watch, be part of the journey, because the right insight at the right time can quietly change everything. Stay awakened, chosen ones.